digital firestorm.
Today, we are exploring the responsibility of free speech. So, freedom of speech is just one part of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. And as such, it has proved to be one of the most difficult liberties of all humanity to understand, to experience, and to defend. So, is freedom of speech really that important? And if so, how do we ensure its survival in a contentious world?
Yeah, so, free speech, and I have to throw this in. I don't think that word means what you think it means. Okay. I think there's a lot of misconceptions of what free speech is. I mean, it's like I said in the beginning, it's lit revolutions and it sparked reform. And now, thanks to everybody, you can do your own podcast. Yeah. And everyone can be a broadcaster. But does everyone understand and shoulder the responsibility that is entrusted to us? And do we just have some arrogance that we are right? Or maybe even just apathy that, there's so much around us that, we're apathetic about our free speech or the value of it?
Yeah, this is really, really hard. And we're glad to have you along for the ride. Hopefully you'll enjoy this discussion between the two of us.
Yeah, so that was a long intro. Welcome back to Centered Live. I'm Randy Burgoyne. This is Paul Malloy. Paul is a historian, a teacher. You'll notice that he has kind of this teacher shtick about him, right? And I'm a geek. I'm a technology guy. And so we merge in a lot of platforms and what interests us, right?
Absolutely.
But we have some variety background. I think that helps us to give you a variety of thoughts and
helps hopefully you to see things in balance, being that beyond the fact that we may not agree on everything, the reality is we're trying to provide you with some information that can allow you to thoughtfully approach sometimes very difficult subjects, and this would certainly be one of them.
Yep.
So as we jump into this idea of freedom of speech and the fact that it is a challenging freedom, which was carefully added to the U.S. Constitution 2 years after the Constitution was ratified, after it was accepted. So in light of this week's festivities being 4th of July and Independence Day and all of the celebrations that went along with it, here is a super fast overview of the founding of the United States. Are you ready? Hold on tight, cinch down the seatbelt because this is going to go fast. So leading up to the 1770s, English colonists living here in North America felt that their rights as English citizens, having been established by English law, according to the Magna Carta, which was written and presented in 1215, were being ignored. At the center of that debate was taxation without representation in Parliament. This led to armed skirmishes between patriot rebels and the soldiers of King George III beginning in 1773. Multiple failed attempts to negotiate led to what we recognize and what we celebrate on July 4th as the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Now, that was followed in 1777 by our first attempt at national government. That document was known as the Articles of Confederation. And that created a weak federal government and strong state governments, like they were governments unto themselves with almost no leeway or passageways to cooperate. So the War of Independence ends through the British surrender in 1781 and then made official by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But England did not consider the United States of America as a legitimate country because there was no real national government. So in 1787, the US Constitution was hotly debated between about March through September of 1787, and it was finally signed in September. And immediately, the process that was defined by the Constitution of the United States was put in motion to elect a president of the United States, that being, of course, George Washington. He was elected in 1788. In 1789, the US Constitution was officially ratified by 2/3 of the states, which was necessary to make it official, even though the states were, in essence, already acting as if it were official. But what's interesting here is that in 1791, some of the framers of the Constitution came back and said, we need a list of rights of the citizens. And what they did is they created the first 10 amendments, became known as the Bill of Rights. And the first amendment granted the freedoms of religion, assembly, petition, press, and the freedom of speech.
So, I was just joking at the beginning when I said that, I don't think that word means what you think it means. But really, what is free speech? What does that mean?
Right.
And what are the responsibilities to go with it?
Yeah, usually, especially in today's society, we hear the word free and we think, well, it means it doesn't cost anything. In this particular case, the phrase of free speech means that it should not have any restrictions, that we have the right to, in essence, say anything that we want. Mm-hmm. No restrictions, right? Okay. But then that creates, especially now in our modern context, that can create a lot of debatable issues.
Yeah. So we're talking about free speech, and especially on a platform like this,
right?
Like a podcast or YouTube or Facebook or whatever social media you find us on. There's a lot of people that are saying what they feel is right. Some of it's misleading, some of it's good, and it's up to you to decide. And hopefully our Centered Live here can help you determine that. But we get into things like AI generated things. We get into anonymity. For years, people have realized that if your identity is hidden when you make a statement, you're going to frame it a lot more strongly, different.
Okay, different for sure. Yeah.
Than you would if you were standing up there and your name was plastered across your chest and saying, okay, Randy Burgoyne says that, and it's going to be a different message.
Yeah. And we're seeing that, which is where digital bullying comes from. This is where people are willing to blatantly say falsehoods and in essence get away with it, because it's like, well, who said that? And if you try to track it down, it ends up going to a dead end. And yet people are going to accept, especially if it aligns with their core beliefs already, they're going to say, okay, well, that is fact, even though it may not be fact. And you can't prove that it's fact or fiction because it's anonymous.
Right. And there's a lot that you can explore about the misinformation that we get on the internet, right?
Right.
You have a tremendous digital footprint,
right?
Where as you broadcast, you have the ability to broadcast to a lot of people. Now, here's the thing: is a lot of people are like I said, are giving their opinions.
Mhm.
There maybe have some fact, some anecdotal evidence that they've come up with,
Or a kernel of truth that then gets manipulated to expand into something that has almost
Right.
no similarity to reality.
And then you have things like confirmation bias.
Mhm.
We talked about a few
Mhm.
episodes
Mhm.
ago, where you're looking for something and then all of a sudden you grab a hold of it and say, yeah, that's right, even though it may not be
Right.
correct.
Right.
So there's all these aspects of what is free speech. Doesn't necessarily mean it's correct.
True. Yeah, right. Absolutely. So free speech does not mean that it's going to be true or correct speech.
Mhm.
And especially, again, like you said, in a world of anonymity, you can't hold somebody that is unknown responsible for what they say.
Right.
And that is now obviously creating a lot of problems. In fact, that problem extends through all of our news sources, because even news sources, the vast majority of them have bias, leaning either right or left. But even the ones that try to stay centered or unbiased have then a responsibility to try to track down the source of any given statement and then confirm whether that is accurate or not. And sometimes it just gets repeated so many times from source to source to source that somebody says, well, okay, I was able to confirm that source C restated what source B stated because they heard it from source A. Therefore, it must be true and correct. And in fact, it can be discovered or sometimes uncovered that it was not true to begin with. So it's tough. It's really tough. But this is the other thing, is that it's not just what you say, it can also be how you say it. And one of the things that we're certainly struggling with is not only the propaganda, not only what are sometimes referred to as echo chambers, where everybody is essentially saying the same thing. And we see this in corporations, we see this in governments, where the leaders surround themselves with people who are already going to support their thinking and their direction without any consideration for, well, wait a second, maybe that doesn't make sense, or that isn't the best path to travel. And that's what we mean by echo chambers. So it's that, plus how far do we go in terms of not just stretching the truth, but how far do we allow the I don't know. I would say the problem of things like profanity, the things that are designed to be cruel, the things that are designed to be purposefully misleading, and they're stated so crudely and sometimes shock value.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it.
Well, in the 80s, when I took a media marketing class, the rules of publishing a document were horrendous. I mean, for a writer to write an article and have it published in, one of our Salt Lake Tribune or Deseret News, or even some of the smaller papers, he would go through an editorial process to vet, to make sure it was correct.
Right.
I think that in today's world, technology has bypassed some of those checks and balances to make sure that we have good information. So an individual might grab onto it and say, I heard it from a good source. That's one source. You need to validate that with additional sources.
Yeah, and where we run into some real problems, of course, with that is that the originator could say, I am using, or I'm exercising my freedom of speech. In other words, you can't censor me. You cannot censure me, because what I say is what I believe. Doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong. I am going to speak my mind, and I don't care if it's right or wrong, because it's what I believe. And furthermore, I don't even care who I might hurt through what I'm saying. So it would seem that we have kind of walked away from a responsibility to what was intended as freedom of speech from the beginning.
Yeah, and maybe it's because we felt more of a citizen in our community,
Maybe.
where we had stores and activities, would go to downtown a lot more than we do now.
Yeah.
You can just stay in your home and have food delivered, right? But the point I guess is I'm making is that when you meet people and see them face to face, you have this citizenship mentality and this culture that grows, this culture of trust.
Yes.
The culture of honesty.
The more we interact physically with each other,
right,
the more likely that we are going to respect that person, the more we're going to try to work with that person, even when that person may disagree. So like you and I, we don't see eye to eye on every single thing, but we would try to work out the difference until we at least come to a compromise, or possibly we would just simply say, Randy, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that.
Right.
But we would be okay out of respect for each other.
Yeah. So how can we have that feeling of citizenship extend to our digital world?
Right. That's a great question.
I mean, I know there's been laws that have tried to regulate it, but they've all failed. I mean, how can we have a citizenry of people on the internet?
Yeah, who are disconnected, who feel almost empowered by their isolation.
Yeah.
And that does in fact create an interesting challenge. We are becoming more and more disconnected, more and more polarized, because we are not interacting one-on-one or one-on-many or many-on-many as often as we had previously. And it's not just in the shopping centers. Think about the movie theaters that are struggling because, of course, with streaming services, you can watch great movies, first-run movies at home in your basement on large screens with surround sound. So it's like the movie theater almost doesn't have an advantage to go and participate unless you really wanted that immersive experience, and not just of the screen, but of the people that are there.
And if you really want movie theater popcorn, you want to pay $15 for a little.
Yeah, but now of course you could get really good popcorn out of your microwave.
Oh, that's right. They even have theater flavored popcorn.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, as we talk about this, it almost makes that understanding maybe more logical, as illogical as it may be. More logical when we start thinking, well, maybe history is wrong, and we try to rewrite history in a way that aligns more with how we feel or how we think, rather than what actually happened. And then that's where you come up with this idea of historical erasure. And we're starting to say, well, I don't agree with how that went, so I'm going to come up with a different version of history that skips over something that could be bad, but something that also could be really good. We have tended to erase out of our history anything that has previously been considered religious, trying to get rid of that. And does that help us? Does that hurt us?
Yeah, well, I have feelings about that, but the point I guess that I'm reaching for is, how do we take this message and share it with the masses? I mean, we have our podcast. We'd love to have others, if you disagree with us or have comments, add them below so that we can learn better of how this can apply to everybody on the internet. Yeah,
for sure. So there is a moral weight that comes with speaking one's mind. And, it used to be, and I would try to share this with my kids, my own children, as well as my students. And that is that, yes, you have freedom of speech. You have the freedom to act the way you want, but you cannot escape the consequences that come with that decision, that choice.
Right.
And yet it seems like we are trying to somehow clip that relationship between our decision and the consequences. And this becomes really challenging, especially as a classroom educator, to help students understand that, yes, you absolutely have the right to say and do anything that you want, but there are consequences. And some of those consequences, so let's understand that good choices bring good consequences, and poor choices will bring bad consequences to varying degrees.
And inevitably, the truth will come out.
Right.
A couple of weeks ago, we had my son Aaron on talking about fraud and some of his investigations, where people take advantage. They lie about the use of money to get people to invest in them. Then they get careless, I guess, and think that they're invincible.
Yeah.
They can just storm through anything. They're above the law.
Right.
And then the truth comes out. And it's a hard fall, but it does come out, and they will fall. But unfortunately, it takes a lot of people with them.
Yeah.
And we can do the same thing with our words.
Yes.
Not just necessarily our money.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And the sad thing is that when we see this happen, sometimes, especially our politicians, maybe our celebrities, it seems like, when they get caught, that the consequence dissipates, or somehow they manage to get away with a lesser consequence than maybe would have previously been approved or appointed.
Right.
And so then that makes the rest of us kind of think, well, they got away with it. Maybe I can too. Right. But that in itself, coupled with the point that most people feel protected by the anonymity of their home, right? That we end up seeing so much online harassment. We see a lot of people that are without any thought, just spouting off, typically without any kind of research, any kind of educated information, just literally speaking their own mind. And it seems like if the more rude, lewd, crude that it is for shock value, the more attention that it gets. And is that a fair use of freedom of speech? There was and I have to apologize that I don't remember the name right off the top of my head, and I should. So that's a fault in mine. But it was stated that I don't agree with you, but I will fight to defend your right to say, your opinion.
Right.
Is that still valid? Is it still valuable that we say, look, I don't agree with, this other point of view, but you do have the right to say it. And then how far does that go?
Right. So as a teacher, I'm sure you've been asked this, or you've heard comments, well, they ought to teach that in school.
Yeah.
Why are we having to teach our kids this? That should be something they teach in school. Let's add a class for X and Y and Z. And before you know it, the ABCs are gone. They don't know how to read. But you have some special interest groups that are happy because their kids are learning how to be. Sorry, I was going to say a bad word. So how do we teach this? Is there an ethics class? And now I took a class in college in the 80s in communications. For a while, I had switched my major to business communications. So I took all the media classes, all the psychology, the society classes, and had learned a lot about it. And I appreciate that education. But I don't see those kind of principles. I don't know if they're being taught, but they're not being used by any means. That you have a respect for somebody because of their opinion, not because they're right or wrong. You have respect for somebody's religion, even though it may be different, and you don't belittle them or degrade them, but you respect that they have a moral code that they have followed and are making the world a better place.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because in truth, schools are now, they are teaching more ethics. They are teaching the idea that there has to be a way to negotiate and to work together, to cooperate, to, in some cases, again, compromise, so that the better good is served. And this is now slowly being added to certain kinds of curriculum in schools. And you might think, well, that should be the job of the parent in the home. And that is absolutely true. But so many parents have abdicated that right and have asked the schools to teach that now the schools are in fact trying to answer that need, because it's not being taught widely in the home environment any longer. And of course, in terms of sociology, there are maybe a billion reasons why that is the case. So certainly, as a history teacher, I have, and I had a sign in my classroom that says, "I have the courage to teach hard history," which means not erased history, right? And so we talked about the motivations of people who made catastrophic mistakes, or even minor mistakes that ended up impacting millions of people. And we would talk about the whys, not just the whats, and that's important. We would then analyze how it impacted from that point forward through time and now impacts us today. That is true history, not just teaching names, dates, and places to be able to pass a test. That's crap history. So that was one arena that I certainly tried to leverage some of those concepts of ethics and morals, not in terms of a religion-based moral system, but in terms of a humanity-based system of morals. The other place that, interestingly, I was able to share a lot of this kind of concept was in my speech and debate classes, because you have to listen. That's the number one rule in debate, is listen to your opponent. And as you listen to your opponent, then you can answer more appropriately, more educationally, than if you just simply spout out what you think or what you feel without going through the process of saying, all right, does this make sense? Am I positioning this in an effective way, and so forth? But I think that that was one of the most powerful lessons that came through my speech and debate classes, was how to hear, not just hear, but listen to somebody who has an opposing point of view, and then be able to work your view and position, and then try to come to some kind of awareness.
Right. And a lot of times in the middle of that, you realize that you have a lot more in common than you think.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
So maybe there's a few points that you differ on.
Yeah.
But really, the source is the same.
Right. Right. And what we're really talking about here is this idea of critical thinking, which is foundational. It is paramount that we slow down so we can think through not just, again, what we say, but how we're going to say it. And sometimes people have told me, well, if I don't say it in a screaming voice, if I don't say it laden with profanities, nobody's going to pay attention to me. Nobody's going to hear me.
Right.
And where there may be some sad truth to that, that doesn't make it right. Especially when people are being hurt by the wrongful things that are being said, even in some cases, if what is being said could be construed as truthful. And that would be an example would be, saying, oh, you really messed up and you deserve to be punished and there's no redemption. And, it's one of those things is where, like, hearing that is not going to be encouraging. It's not going to solve a problem. It's going to create a bigger problem, as opposed to if we said, oh, I see where you went wrong, or, where we differ. Let's see if we can figure this out for the sake of cooperation. Not the sake of surrendering truth, but for the sake of valuing the other person as a human being.
You're right. So let's back up for just a minute. And I keep going back to my college classes in the 80s. It was a real influential time in my life, right? You're
sure
in my mid-20s.
Sure.
I'm just absorbing lots of knowledge. And for the first time in my life, I learned how to learn.
Right.
So, but there was one term that was used repeatedly in our media communications class, and that's yellow journalism.
Oh, of course.
So you think of the tabloids. So-and-so had an alien baby. And will it look like Marilyn Monroe, or will it look like the alien?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff was just fantastical, was stupid.
Well, and there is a difference, because certain publications do get away with that because they refer to themselves as entertainment, which means that they do not have to stay strictly with what is true. Yellow journalism in particular came about when newspapers exaggerated the truth to the point to where they were making facts up to sell more newspapers and passing it off as truth.
Yeah.
And we do still see that.
Yep. Even in newspapers.
Yeah.
Even in big name newspapers.
Radio shows, TV shows.
Yep. And the ones that should know better.
Yes. Yeah. So one of the things that I think that we're both in agreement is that when we talk about this freedom of speech, yes, it's a right. And we should be really thankful for that freedom of speech as established, as designed and established by our founding fathers, who had the foresight to actually add that, amend it, hence the amendments, right? Yep. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States, and including this freedom in the very first amendment to the Constitution of the United States. But we need to understand that it's much more than a right. It also needs to be developed as a skill, which means that we need to not only learn how to correctly wield our freedom of speech,
right,
but also to understand that there is a weight of responsibility that comes with that right, or that liberty, that freedom.
Right. Interesting. So I guess to wrap things up, we want to look at it and say, okay, it's on every one of us to take this freedom of speech and practice it and let it become a skill.
Right.
A skill that we develop. And I think that, even at the beginning of our podcast to now, we've developed some skills. Maybe our first few podcasts were a little awkward. We're still learning the technology. Actually, he was fine. It was but I guess the point is we're learning the process of producing a podcast. When you tweet, when you post, when you comment, think of how that will be taken by others, how it can be construed. Too often people say, "Oh, that's baloney," and leave it. Well, that was maybe a comment somebody had from their heart, and it's frustrating. So don't comment out of context. Learn what is the real topic. Make appropriate and helpful suggestions.
As if you were there with that person,
Right.
as opposed to being digitally disconnected.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah. So that's our challenge for you, is to remember the importance, the responsibility of correctly and appropriately using your freedom of speech.
Thanks for attending and watching, and thanks, Paul, for a compelling topic. Be sure to like and share and subscribe. We love new subscribers. They help us to grow. So please do that. And next time, we'll see you again later. Thanks for joining us.